I'm here to propose that the Planning Commission consider suggesting to the Borough Council the passage of two separate ordinances that would provide increased accessibility to the citizens living in in the Borough of State College and visiting the Borough of State College. The two ordinances that I have in mind are one, an ordinance that has to do with visitability. I sent in response to John Ike's email an email to 400 people or so. I suspect that many of you have received it on the email list or have it sitting there in your inboxes. So I won't take up all of it, but essentially the issue, the first issue has to do with what is called visitability. This is an ordinance that comes out of an organization in the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, whereby a hole in accessibility issues is filled in to some degree. The ordinance, which is now in effect in some 50 communities in the United States, essentially provides that there ought to be, for every new home that is constructed, an entrance which is wheelchair accessible. It does not necessarily have to be the front entrance. That the doors to the entrance have to be wide enough to get a wheelchair through, and that there be a partial bath on the main floor with a door that is wide enough to get a wheelchair through. This is by no means a solution to the problem of major housing problem for the elderly and disabled, but it is a step in the right direction. This ordinance would require that COG, which enforces the building code requirements for State College, withhold building permits for any construction company, any construction at all, which fails to provide for these things. The other ordinance would be broader in scope and easier to pass for a variety of reasons, and that would require that renters, before the new units be constructed, that there be accessibility provisions in place before a rental permit is issued by COG on behalf of the Borough of State College.
Anybody like to comment on that?
I think that the concept of visibility is an important one for us to be looking at, whether it fits into a zoning ordinance, a subdivision and land development ordinance, or codes. I'm not sure, but since we're looking at updating the zoning ordinance shortly, I thought this was an appropriate thing to look at. I think I sent to staff a couple weeks back an article about a house out in Illinois that was not only met visibility standards, but also had incorporated passive solar into the design. And I think these are both things that we ought to be looking at.
I wanted to add that the idea of providing accessibility is a greed issue that the Planning Commission and the borough ought to think of in terms of improving the economy of the borough of State College while we are surrounded by thriving residential communities for retirement people who are unable or have a great difficulty getting into the borough as a consequence of the considerable hurdles that are involved in getting from Foxdale, for example, to here, or to somebody's house.
When I was in Cumberland, we actually did a number of projects that were visitable as far as making sure they were grade to allow for accessibility. So that I think it's something we could add as part of the scope as we're building the scope for the zoning revision. So both through the process the Planning Commission has done, but through other conversations with ABCs, I think how we do ADA and how we do accessibility keeps coming up. So I think it's clearly something that should get added.
Zoe?
Could you clarify for me, for the second ordinance that you proposed, how does that differ from what we have at present? Because I believe there's some requirement for handicap accessibility in an apartment building or something like that.
Well, there is, under ADA provisions and under the Fair Housing Act of the most recent Fair Housing Act, which predates the 1988 Fair Housing Act, there is no requirement for residences to be the new residences to meet any accessibility standards at all. What I'm talking about in terms of both of these ordinances would have to do with the construction of new buildings. And I spoke to the gentleman in charge of code this afternoon, and the idea of the rental provisions requiring that any contractor who is building a house or an apartment condominium unit of fewer than 4 units, of which there are a considerable number in that category, be required to establish what I would regard as accessibility requirements. And the council could then decide how extensive those accessibility requirements are, but they are much easier to get through, and you could not get the one issue of visitability would mean that constructors of new housing could not get a building permit. The second would mean that anybody wanting to rent any of these houses would not get a rental permit. And it's a lot easier to create an ordinance prohibiting the issuance of a rental agreement than it is to issue a building permit, although both ordinances are reasonable and achievable.
And your second differs from current ordinances in that it would apply to smaller construction projects than is currently required?
Well, I mean, right now, people rent out individual houses, they build a house and they rent it out. And there are some units of houses and condominiums within the borough that have 3 units in them. In either case, neither of those are covered at all in terms of new construction, in terms of the issuance of a new rental agreement. This would require that any unit that is put up for rent meet accessibility standards.
To clarify, are you suggesting just that new units being built for rental should come under these ordinances, or that any existing housing that becomes rental should not be issued a permit unless it's fully accessible?
I am suggesting that the situation in the borough of State College and in the general area and in central Pennsylvania and throughout the United States is deplorable when it comes to providing accessible housing. 95% of all new homes that are constructed in the United States do not have steps in each of the entrances. What I'm proposing is a modest way of trying to get a handle on what is a major national crisis, and a crisis which I believe affects the future of State College within the next 10 years.
But to clarify, because people out there are going to be wondering what's going on, do you intend to make this retroactive to existing housing, or is this for new housing?
Right now, all I'm talking about is new housing.
Thank you. Otherwise, we're going to be hearing a lot from people who aren't affected. Ed, what is the procedure for this? Do we have to wait for direction from council, or can we just work this into what we're working on ongoing?
Well, first thing is I think there might be some technical issues to discuss with code as far as the legal powers that would be involved with this. So that would be maybe an informational item that staff can report back to the Planning Commission about, just to clear where the authority lies. That's probably important.
Would you like that clarification now, or do you want to wait and get it?
Did you speak with Walt then on that?
I spoke to Walt. I spoke to the solicitor for the borough, Terry Williams, and I spoke to Mr. Fontaine.
Well, I think so it sounds like you've covered all the bases as
I've
far as...
covered all the bases.
So
But
this
the
rest
answer
would
is
use...
very complicated.
That's what I figured. So maybe we'll talk offline. How's that?
That sounds fine.
Okay, so we're agreed that we'll be talking about this in future, and we're not trying to put you off, it's just,
No, I
it's
understand.
complicated.
It'll be a complicated
This
answer.
is the beginning of the beginning.
Okay, thank you for bringing this up.